everyone, CW Music Reviews here. I am CWD and this is going to be a music review of the new Vektor album, Terminal Redux. Vektor are a thrash metal, progressive metal quartet based in Philadelphia, and this is their latest full-length album. I caught on to these guys about a year or so ago when a friend of mine recommended me Black Future. That was a really overwhelming and really painstakingly aggressive experience. Really dense and really heavy riffage all throughout that also demonstrate a lot of technique and complexities and just outright viscera, all the while perpetuating a sci-fi type atmosphere and concept to it. Not so much a concept album, or from what I can tell, since the vocalist's voice is so ear-piercingly high-pitched that it reminds me of some like death type vocals. But regardless, this was a really interesting yet overwhelming experience, to the point where after I listened to it, I stopped listening to metal for about 3 weeks. Then I listened to their sophomore album, Outer Isolation. Not as great as Black Future was, but still remained to be great. If anything, this was the album that helped me try to digest what it is Vektor were doing, as it was probably their most accessible release to date. You still had the sci-fi stuff going on, you still had the riffage, the complexities going on, just not as grandiose and dense as Black Future was. Regardless though, Vektor to me are probably the last great thrash metal band. There hasn't been really many attempts and resurgence for the genre in terms of new bands. You have Havoc that are still doing their thing pretty much. You have bands like Black Breath that are transitioning away from this crossover thrash sound and this death and roll sound in favor of making music that are straight up thrash and death metal. And then you have bands like Vektor that are doing the sound not just justice, but really marking a fresh and new and really intriguing face to the genre. And with this new album, Terminal Redux, this is definitely the magnum opus of that. This album is about 10 tracks in length, about 76 minutes long. It's a really dense listen, per se. What I like about this album is that it takes the density and the over-the-topness, if that's even a word, of Black Future, along with the accessibility and maybe slightly more conceptual bits of Outer Isolation, and really bringing them together, and then some, for not just my favorite Vektor release to date, but probably the best metal album of the year. Take the opening track, Charging the Void. You get this kind of spacey intro going on before the riffage comes in and tears up everything. And it's not just a change from one rhythm and riffage to another over and over and over again for the sake of just doing so, like a good chunk of prog metal likes to do, but it's more so for the sake of narrative momentum, as this album is probably their most conceptual to date, with pretty much this album being an auditory sci-fi film surrounding this intergalactic general that goes into this void of no return of some sort, and somehow comes out not just alive and surviving it, but also power hungry and really antagonistic. This track seems to be the intro for his diving into this void in the universe, of which no one thought he would survive, and the next track, Cygnus Terminal, he would. But to stay on the course of Charging the Void, eventually you get this intergalactic sounding soul vocalists going off in the background. Ooh, 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 ah, as the track really climaxes it really well. And from there the narrative just continues with ending and middle bits I don't want to spoil, because that would kind of defeat the purpose of the narrative. I will say one thing, the production on this album, someone needs to tell producers like Rick Rubin and them that this is how you produce metal music. The vocals come in nice and clear as a whistle. The guitars have the punch and the viscera that comes with a metal album, but it's not so perfectly produced that it loses its human tendency. This can also be applicable to the playing of the album. The bass is there. It's not that upfront, but it's certainly there. It's given its moment. I mean, hell, the track Psychotropia has a guitar and bass duel where the bass shines the most on the entire record. The drums, they definitely have enough punch as much as they need without sounding incredibly overbearing. Everything sounds upfront and so visceral and so operatic, and this is really impressive seeing as there's like no sound compression used in this metal album whatsoever. This is proof that you can make a great metal album without having the guitar so overblown and so loud that you can barely process like anything whatsoever. So what's going on with the composition and performance? Well, really good things compositionally. In terms of prog metal and thrash metal, it's not really doing anything new, but there's something about this album that makes it sound fresh, that makes it sound like this is the first time I'm listening to thrash metal, and that's what I admire about the riffage here. Tracks like Cygnus Terminal have like this riffage that sounds really dissonant before it eventually builds into this really aggressive and fast-paced type riffage that I enjoy a lot. As the sci-fi drama that goes on where the intergalactic general meets back up with, I guess, some of his crew or some of his galactic pirate enemies or something of that nature, really start getting antagonistic towards him and wondering how it is he survived going into the void. I mean, this composition is like so well written, so well performed that with the track Mountains Above the Sun, which is pretty much the interlude track, if you're familiar with my reviews on the channel, usually the interlude tracks are usually going to be my least favorites on the album, but this one, it's just so well put together given like how subdued and soft it is before it eventually goes into this upbeat and more upfront riffage that glides perfectly into Artemis Our Pfizer that I can't help but like even think this track is great. There's not a single track on this album that isn't well developed and isn't great. Not a single one that I can name. Because as I said before, the performances are so tight, really visceral and really aggressive and really progressive without losing its human edge. Like the track Liquid Crystal Disease, where when the guitar solo kicks, it sounds like there's a moment where he can't control his own energy and his own viscera. It's really admirable. Every guitar solo here is really just human and in the moment, especially the guitar and bass duel in Psychotropia. I will also say that the choruses here and like the hooks on this album are really in the moment as well. Like the track Pteropticon. But there's even some moments on the latter half of the album, specifically the last two tracks, where they go into their cleans, not just in vocals, but also guitar. Like the track Collapse, which is easily one of my favorite tracks on the record. This is their most post-rock-ish sounding track on the record. As like the guitars get really clean, the chords are nice, the drums kinda go into a mezzo forte, borderline mezzo piano type sound, and they're singing like really pleasantly over this smooth instrumental. And eventually the song just progresses into like something a bit more alarming. It keeps going and going and going that it just doesn't even feel like it's 9 minutes long. And that's the thing about this album. Each track here, with the exception of Mountains Above the Sun, it doesn't go anywhere below the 5-minute mark. And none of them feel like that they're as long as they say they are. Even the closing track, Recharging the Void, which is 13 minutes long and is probably the most multifaceted and intricate song on the album. As with this track, the suicide mission is beginning. And with the middle of the track, as it goes back into that subdued part, as I mentioned with Collapse, it sounds like that they're saying goodbye. Please sure the universe knows our story and tell them what it is we risked here. That's another thing I like about this album. It takes the viscera and aggression of a thrash metal album, the multifaceted nature and complexity of a prog metal album, and the narrative momentum and the dramatic atmosphere of opera. This is essentially a really great operatic thrash metal album of the sci-fi nature. Now, is this album perfect? I actually had to debate myself about this for a while, and it's led me to have to listen to the album over and over and over again, more so than I've ever had to listen to an album before ever actually reviewing it. And I came to the conclusion that it's close. It's not perfect, but it's close. The reason for that is that, one, while these riffs are fantastic, tracks like Pteropticon, Psychotropia, and Ultimate Artificer, all these riffs are fantastic, there's not too much variety for something that's of this operatic nature. Really, the only thing that keeps the narrative going is the lyrics. Everything after maybe either LCD or Mountains Above the Sun, and everything before Collapse, there's not really too much within the 20 or so minutes that you can just rearrange the track listing to where the narrative would still work. Plus, I think my least favorite track on the album has to be Pillars of Sand, which is probably one of the more straightforward thrash metal tracks on the album and doesn't really add too much sonically to the album that hasn't already been added. But it's still a great track. Like I said, there's no track on the album that's less than great. But that's really it. There's almost literally nothing negative I can say about this record. I think Vektor have not just done it again, they've pretty much released their best album to date. They take all these ideas that they usually have and they flesh them out to the point where you couldn't really ask for any more than this. And they did it with some really great production and a really nice sci-fi narrative to go with the background. I do wish that there was more variety to these tracks. The only bits of production experimentation that go on with this album are the background vocals on Charging the Void, as well as the background vocals on Recharging the Void, that I do like a lot. I just hope that when Vektor do come up with another album, they really go all in with this kind of sci-fi opera thing that they got going for them with this album, because they're definitely proving to the world of music that they are probably the most relevant and the greatest thrash metal band of this generation. This album is a plus 2.7 out of plus 3. Yeah, I dug the shit out of this record. If you are a metalhead, you should definitely give this a try. And if you're not necessarily too much into metal, maybe give this a listen at your own risk, because if you're already super into music in general, there's definitely going to be some stuff in it for you. It's got elements of prog rock and post-rock in it. There's like maybe some bits of ambient going on. There's definitely going to be something in here for you that you're going to like. There's no doubt about that. But if you give this album a listen, what did you think of it? Did you like this album? Did you dislike this album? What was your reasoning for that, and what should I consider listening to and reviewing next? This is CDD Music Reviews here, signing off.